Society and Solitude. Society and Solitude is the title of a book Emerson published in 1870. Most of the chapters were already in existence as lectures in 1858 and 1859. Sade melted the days like cups of pearl. Served high and low, the lord and churl. Loved harebells nodding on a rock. A cabin hung with curling smoke, ring of axe or hum of wheel, or gleam which use can paint on steel, and huts and tents, nor loved he less stately lords in palaces, princely women hard to please, fenced by form and ceremony, decked by courtly rites and dress and etiquette of gentillesse. But when the mate of the snow and wind, he left each civil scale behind him, wood gods fed with honey wild, and of his memory beguiled. In caves and hollow trees he crept, and near the wolf and panther slept. He stood before the tumbling main, with joy too tense for sober brain. He shared the life of the element. The tie of blood and home was rent. As if in him the welkin walked. The winds took flesh, the mountains talked, and he the bard, a crystal soul, sphered and concentric with the whole, that each should in his house abide. Therefore was the world so wide. I fell in with a humorist on my travels who had in his chamber a cast of the Rondinini Medusa, and who assured me that the name which that fine work of art bore in the catalogues was of a misnomer, as he was convinced that the sculptor who carved it intended it for memory, the mother of the muses. In the conversation that followed, my new friend made some extraordinary confessions. Do you not see, he said, the penalty of learning, and that each of these scholars whom you have met at S, though he were Stanford, though he were to be the last man, would, like the executioner in Hood's poem, guillotine the last but one. He added many lively remarks, but his evident earnestness engaged my attention, and in the weeks that followed, we became better acquainted. He had good abilities, a genial temper, and no vices. But he had one defect. He could not speak in the tone of the people. There was some paralysis on his will, such that when he met men on common terms, he spoke weakly and from the point, like a flighty girl. His consciousness of the fault made it worse. He envied every drover and lumberman in the tavern their manly speech. He coveted Mirabeau's Don Terrible de la familiarite, believing that he whose sympathy goes lowest is the man from whom kings have the most to fear. For himself, he declared that he could not get enough alone to write a letter to a friend. He left the city. He hid himself in pastures. The solitary river was not solitary enough. The sun and moon put him out. When he bought a house, the first thing he did was to plant trees. He could not enough conceal himself. Set a hedge here, set oaks there, trees behind trees. Above all, set evergreens, for they will keep a secret all the year round. The most agreeable compliment you could pay him was to imply that you had not observed him in a house or a street where you had met him. Whilst he suffered at being seen where he was, he consoled himself with the delicious thought of the inconceivable number of places where he was not. All he wished of his tailor was to provide that sober men of color and cut which would never detain the eye for a moment. He went to Vienna, to Smyrna, to London, in all the variety of costumes, a carnival, a kaleidoscope of clothes. To his horror, he could never discover a man in the street who wore anything like his own dress. He would have given his soul for the ring of Gyges. His dismay at his visibility had blunted the fears of mortality. Do you think, he said, I am in such a great terror of being shot? I, who am only waiting to shuffle off my corporeal jacket to slip away into the back stars and put diameters of the solar system and sidereal orbits between me and all souls, there to wear out ages in solitude and forget memory itself, if it be possible. He had a remorse running to despair of his social gaucheries and walked miles and miles to get the twitchings out of his face, the starts and shrugs of his arms and shoulders. God may forgive sins, he said, but awkwardness has no forgiveness in heaven or earth. He admired in Newton not so much his theory of the moon as his letter to Collins, in which he forbade him to insert his name with the solution of the problem in the philosophical transactions. It would perhaps increase my acquaintance, the thing which I chiefly study to decline. These conversations led me somewhat later to the knowledge of similar cases and to the discovery that they are not of very infrequent occurrence. Few substances are found pure in nature. Those constitutions which can bear in open day the rough dealing of the world must be of that mean and average structure, such as iron and salt, atmospheric air and water. But there are metals like potassium and sodium, which, to be kept pure, must be kept under naphtha. Such are the talents determined on some specialty, which a culminating civilization fosters in the heart of great cities and in royal chambers. Nature protects her own work. To the culture of the world, an Archimedes, a Newton, is indispensable, so she guards them by a certain aridity. If these had been good fellows, fond of dancing, port, and clubs, we should have had no theory of the sphere and no Principia. They had that necessity of isolation which genius feels. Each must stand on his glass tripod if he would keep his electricity. Even Swedenborg, whose theory of the universe is based on affection, and who reprobates to weariness the danger and vice of pure intellect, is constrained to make an extraordinary exception. There are also angels who do not live consociated, but separate, house and house. These dwell in the midst of heaven, because they are the best of angels. We have known many fine geniuses with that imperfection that they cannot do anything useful, not so much as write one clean sentence. It is worse and tragic that no man is fit for society who has fine traits. At a distance he is admired, but bring him hand to hand, he is a cripple. One protects himself by solitude, and one by courtesy, and one by acid, worldly manner, each concealing how he can the thinness of his skin and his incapacity for strict association. But there is no remedy that can reach the heart of the disease, but either habits of self-reliance that should go in practice to making the man independent of the human race, or else a religion of love. Now he hardly seems entitled to marry, for how can he protect a woman who cannot protect himself? We pray to be conventional, but the wary heaven takes care you shall not be, if there is anything good in you. Dante was very bad company. He was never invited to dinner. Michelangelo had a sad, sour time of it. The ministers of beauty are rarely beautiful in coaches and saloons. Columbus discovered no isle or key so lonely as himself. Yet each of these potentates saw well the reason of his exclusion. Solitary was he? Why, yes, but his society was limited only by the amount of brain nature appropriated in that age to carry on the government of the world. If I stay, said Dante, when there was question of going to Rome, who will go? And if I go, who will stay? But the necessity of solitude is deeper than we have said, and is organic. I have seen many a philosopher whose world is large enough for only one person. He affects to be a good companion, but we are still surprising his secret, that he means and needs to impose his system on all the rest. The determination of each is from all the others, like that of each tree up into free space. It is no wonder, when each has his whole head, our societies should be so small. Like President Tyler, our party falls from us every day, and we must ride in a sulky at last. Dear heart, take it sadly home to thee, there is no cooperation. We begin with friendships, and all our youth is a reconnoitring and recruiting of the holy fraternity. They shall combine for the salvation of men. But so the remoter stars seem a nebula of united light, yet there is no group which a telescope will not resolve, and the dearest friends are separated by impassable gulfs. Cooperation is involuntary, and is put upon us by the genius of life, who reserves this as a part of his prerogative. It is fine for us to talk. We sit and muse and are serene and complete. But the moment we meet with anybody, each becomes a fraction. Though the stuff of tragedy and romances is in a moral union of two superior persons whose confidence in each other for long years, out of sight and in sight and against all appearances, is at last justified by victorious proofs of probity to gods and men, causing joyful emotions, tears, and glory. Though there be for heroes this moral union, yet they too are as far off as ever from an intellectual union, and the moral union is for comparatively low and external purposes, like the cooperation of a ship's company or of a fire club. But how insular and pathetically solitary are all the people we know. Nor dare they tell us what they think of each other when they meet in the street. We have a fine right, to be sure, to taunt men of the world with superficial and treacherous courtesies. Such is the tragic necessity which strict science finds underneath our domestic and neighborly life, irresistibly driving each adult soul as with whips into the desert and making our warm covenants sentimental and momentary. We must infer that the ends of thought were peremptory, if they were to be secured at such ruinous cost. They are deeper than can be told, and belong to the immensities and eternities. They reach down to that path where society itself originates and disappears, where the question is, which is first, man or men, where the individual is lost in his source. But this banishment to the rocks and echoes, no metaphysics can make right or tolerable. This result is so against nature, such a half view, that it must be corrected by a common sense and experience. A man is born by the side of his father, and there he remains. A man must be clothed with society, or we shall feel a certain bareness and poverty as of a displaced and unfurnished member. He is to be dressed in arts and institutions, as well as in body garments. Now and then a man exquisitely made can live alone, and must. But coop up most men, and you undo them. The king lived and ate in his hall with men, and understood men, said Selden, when a young barrister said to the late Mr. Mason, quote, I keep my chamber to read law. Read law, replied the veteran. It is in the courtroom you must read law. Nor is the rule otherwise for literature. If you would learn to write, it is in the street you must learn it, both for the vehicle and for the aims of fine arts. You must frequent the public square. The people, and not the college, is the writer's home. The scholar is a candle which the love and desire of all men will light. Never his lands or his rents, but the power to charm the disguised soul that sits veiled under this bearded and that rosy visage is his rent and ration. His products are as needful as those of the baker or the weaver. Society cannot do without cultivated men. As soon as the first wants are satisfied, the higher wants become imperative. It is hard to mesmerize ourselves, to whip our own top. But through sympathy, we are capable of energy and endurance. Concert fires people to a certain fury of performance they can rarely reach alone. Here is the use of society. It is so easy with the great to be great, so easy to come up to an existing standard, as easy as it is to the lover to swim to his maiden through waves so grim before. The benefits of affection are immense, and the one event which never loses its romance is the encounter with superior persons on terms allowing the happiest intercourse. It by no means follows that we are not fit for society, because soirees are tedious, and because the soiree finds us tedious. A backwoodsman who had been sent to the university told me that when he heard the best-bred young men at the law school talk together, he reckoned himself a bore. But whenever he caught them apart and had one to himself alone, then they were the bores, and he the better man. And if we recall the rare hours when we encountered the best persons, we then found ourselves, and then first society seemed to exist. That was society, though in the transom of a brig, or on the Florida Keys. A cold, sluggish blood thinks it has not facts enough to the purpose and must decline its turn in the conversation. But they who speak have no more, have less. It is not new facts that avail, but the heat to dissolve everybody's facts. Heat puts you in right relation with magazines of facts. The capital defect of cold, arid natures is the want of animal spirits. They seem a power incredible, as if God should raise the dead. The recluse witness what others perform by their aid with a kind of fear. It is as much out of his possibility as the prowess of Coeur d'Lion or an Irishman's day's work on the railroad. It is said the present and the future are always rivals. Animal spirits constitute the power of the present, and their feats are like the structure of a pyramid. The result is a lord, a general, or a boon companion. Before these, what a base mendicant is memory with his leathern badge. But the genial heat is latent in all constitutions, and is disengaged only by the friction of society. As Bacon said of manners, to obtain them it only needs not to despise them. So we say of animal spirits that they are the spontaneous product of health and of a social habit. For behavior, men learn it as they take diseases one of another. But the people are to be taken in very small doses. If solitude is proud, so is society vulgar. In society, high advantages are set down to the individual as disqualifications. We sink as easily as we rise through sympathy. So many men whom I know are degraded by their sympathies, their native aims being high enough, but their relation all too tender to the gross people about them. Men cannot afford to live together on their merits, and they adjust themselves by their demerits, by their love of gossip, or by sheer tolerance and animal good nature. They untune and dissipate the brave aspirant. The remedy is to reinforce each of these moods from the other. Conversation will not corrupt us if we come to the assembly in our own garb and speech, and with the energy of health to select what is ours and reject what is not. Society we must have, but let it be society, and not exchanging news or eating from the same dish. Is it society to sit in one of your chairs? I cannot go to the houses of my nearest relatives because I do not wish to be alone. Society exists by chemical affinity and not otherwise. Put any company of people together with freedom for conversation, and a rapid self-distribution takes place into sets and pairs. The best are accused of exclusiveness. It would be more true to say they separate as oil from water, as children from old people, without love or hatred in the matter, each seeking his like, and any interference with the affinities would produce constraint and suffocation. All conversation is a magnetic experiment. I know that my friend can talk eloquently. You know that he cannot articulate a sentence. We have seen him in different company. Assort your party, or invite none. Put Stubbs and Coleridge, Quintilian and Aunt Miriam into pairs, and you make them all wretched. It is an extempore sing-sing built in a parlor. Leave them to seek their own mates, and they will be as merry as sparrows. A higher civility will reestablish in our customs a certain reverence which we have lost. What to do with these brisk young men who break through all fences and make themselves at home in every house? I find out in an instant if my companion does not want me, and ropes cannot hold me when my welcome is gone. One would think that the affinities would pronounce themselves with a surer reciprocity. Here again, as so often, nature delights to put us between extreme antagonisms, and our safety is in the skill with which we keep the diagonal line. Solitude is impracticable, and society fatal. We must keep our head in the one and our hands in the other. The conditions are met if we keep our independence, yet do not lose our sympathy. These wonderful horses need to be driven by fine hands. We require such a solitude as shall hold us to its revelations when we are in the streets and in palaces, for most men are cowed in society and say good things to you in private, but will not stand to them in public. But let us not be the victims of words. Society and solitude are deceptive names. It is not the circumstance of seeing more or fewer people, but the readiness of sympathy that imports. And a sound mind will derive its principles from insight, with ever a purer assent to the sufficient and absolute right, and will accept society as the natural element in which they are to be applied. Farming. This essay was first published as one chapter of Society and Solitude. It was originally entitled The Man with the Hoe and was delivered at the Middlesex Cattle Show on September 29th, 1858. Concord was mainly a farming country in Emerson's time. His own property consisted of a house and a 10-acre farm, which was worked for him by hired labor. Although Emerson was not a handy man with tools and implements, he enjoyed gardening and took a special pride in his fruit trees and grapes, and occasionally took prizes for good fruit at the annual agricultural fairs. To these men, the landscape is an armory of powers, which, one by one, they know to draw and use. They harness beast, bird, insect to their work. They prove the virtues of each bed of rock, and like the chemist mid his loaded jars, draw from each stratum its adapted use, to drug their crops or weapon their arts withal. They turn the frost upon their chemic heap, and keep the wind to winnow pulse and grain. They thank the spring flood for its fertile slime, and on cheap summit levels of the snow, slide with the sledge to inaccessible woods, over meadows bottomless. So year by year, they fight the elements with elements, and by the order in the field disclose, the order regnant in the yeoman's brain, what these strong masters wrote at large in miles. I followed in small copy in my acre, but there's no rood has not a star above it. The cordial quality of pear or plum ascends as gladly in a single tree as in broad orchards resonant with bees, and every atom poises for itself and for the whole. He planted where the deluge plowed. His hired hands were wind and cloud. His eyes detect the gods concealed in the hummock of the field. Farming. The glory of the farmer is that in the division of labors, it is his part to create. All trade rests at last on his primitive activity. He stands close to nature. He obtains from the earth. Page 73 to 83. In the division layers, stands close to nature. He obtains from the earth the bread and the meat. The food which was not, he causes to be. The first farmer was the first man, and all historic nobility rests on possession and use of land. Men do not like hard work, but every man has an exceptional respect for tillage, and a feeling that this is the original calling of his race, that he himself is only excused from it by some circumstance which made him delegate it for a time to other hands. If he have not some skill which recommends him to the farmer, some product for which the farmer will give him corn, he must himself return into his due place among the planters, and the profession has in all eyes its ancient charm, as standing nearest to God, the first cause. Then the beauty of nature, the tranquility and innocence of the countryman, his independence and his pleasing arts, the care of bees, of poultry, of sheep, of cows, the dairy, the care of hay, of fruits, of orchards and forests, and the reaction of these on the workman in giving him a strength and plain dignity like the face and manners of nature, all men acknowledge. All men keep the farm in reserve as an asylum where, in case of mischance, to hide their poverty, or a solitude if they do not succeed in society. And who knows how many glances of remorse are turned this way from the bankrupts of trade, from mortified pleaders in courts and senates, or from the victims of idleness and pleasure. Poised by town life and town vices, the sufferer resolves, well, my children, whom I have injured, shall go back to the land, to be recruited and cured by that which should have been my nursery, and now shall be their hospital. The farmer's office is precise and important. But you must not try to paint him in rose color. You cannot make pretty compliments to fate and gravitation, whose minister he is. He represents the necessities. It is the beauty of the great economy of the world that makes his comeliness. He bends to the order of the seasons, the weather, the soils, and crops, as the sails of a ship bend to the wind. He represents continuous hard labor, year in, year out, and small gains. He is a slow person, timed to nature, and not to city watches. He takes the pace of seasons, plants, and chemistry. Nature never hurries. Atom by atom, little by little, she achieves her work. The lesson one learns in fishing, yachting, hunting, or planting is the manners of nature, patience with the delays of wind and sun, delays of the seasons, bad weather, excess or lack of water, patience with the slowness of our feet, with the parsimony of our strength, with the largeness of sea and land we must traverse, etc. The farmer times himself to nature and acquires that livelong patience which belongs to her. Slow, narrow man, his rule is that the earth shall feed and clothe him, and he must wait for his crop to grow. His entertainments, his liberties, and his spending must be on a farmer's scale and not on a merchant's. It were as false for farmers to use a whole sail and massy expense as for states to use a minute economy. But if thus pinched on one side, he has compensatory advantages. He is permanent, clings to his land as the rocks do. In the town where I live, farms remain in the same families for 7 and 8 generations, and most of the first settlers in 1635, should they reappear on the farms today, would find their own blood and names still in possession, and the like fact holds in the surrounding towns. This hard work will always be done by one kind of man, not by scheming speculators, not by soldiers, nor professors, nor readers of Tennyson, but by men of endurance, deep-chested, long-winded, tough, slow and sure, and timely. The farmer has a great health, and the appetite of health, and means to his end. He has broad lands for his home, wood to burn great fires, plenty of plain food. His milk, at least, is unwatered, and for sleep he has cheaper and better and more of it than citizens. He has grave trusts confided to him. In the great household of nature, the farmer stands at the door of the bread room and weighs to each his loaf. It is for him to say whether men shall marry or not. Early marriages and the number of births are indissolubly connected with abundance of food. As Burke said, man breeds at the mouth. Then he is the board of quarantine. The farmer is a hoarded capital of health, as the farm is the capital of wealth, and it is from him that the health and power, moral and intellectual, of the cities came. The city is always recruited from the country. The men in cities who are the centers of energy, the driving wheels of trade, politics, or practical arts, and the women of beauty and genius are the children or grandchildren of farmers and are spending the energies which their fathers' hardy, silent life accumulated in frosty furrows, in poverty, necessity, and darkness. He is the continuous benefactor. He who digs a well, constructs a stone fountain, plants a grove of trees by the roadside, plants an orchard, builds a durable house, reclaims a swamp, or so much as puts a stone seat by the wayside, makes the land so far lovely and desirable, makes a fortune which he cannot carry away with him, but which is useful to his country long afterwards. The man that works at home helps society at large with somewhat more of certainty than he who devotes himself to charities. If it be true that not by votes of political parties, but by the eternal laws of political economy, slaves are driven out of a slave state as fast as it is surrounded by free states, then the true abolitionist is the farmer who, heedless of laws and constitutions, stands all day in the field, investing his labor in the land and making a product with which no forced labor can compete. We commonly say that the rich men can speak the truth, can afford honesty, can afford independence of opinion and action, and that is the theory of nobility. But it is the rich men, in a true sense, that is to say, not the man of large income and large expenditure, but solely the man whose outlay is less than his income and is steadily kept so. In English factories, the boy that watches the loom to tie the thread when the wheel stops to indicate that a thread is broken is called a mender. And in this great factory of our Copernican globe, shifting its slides, rotating its constellations, times, and tides, bringing now the day of planting, then of watering, then of weeding, then of reaping, then of curing and storing. The farmer is the mender. His machine is of colossal proportions. The diameter of the water wheel, the arms of the levers, the power of the battery are out of all mechanic measure, and it takes him long to understand its parts and its working. This pump never sucks. These screws are never loose. This machine is never out of gear. The vat and piston, wheels and tires never wear out, but are self-repairing. Who are the farmer's servants? Not the Irish, nor the coolies, but geology and chemistry. A quarry of the air, the water of the brook, the lightning of the cloud, the casting of the worm, the plow of the frost. Long before he was born, the son of ages decomposed the rocks, mellowed his land, soaked it with light and heat, covered it with vegetable film, then with forests, and accumulated the sphagnum whose decay made the past of his meadow. Science has shown the great circles in which nature works, the manner in which marine plants balance the marine animals, as the land plants supply the oxygen which the animals consume, and the animals the carbon which the plants absorb. These activities are incessant. Nature works on a method of all for each and each for all. The strain that is made on one point bears on every arch and foundation of the structure. There is a perfect solidarity. You cannot detach an atom from its holdings, or strip off from it the electricity, gravitation, chemic affinity, or the relation to light and heat, and leave the atom bare. No, it brings with it its universal ties. Nature, like a cautious testator, ties up her estate so as not to bestow it all on one generation, but has a forelooking tenderness and equal regard to the next, and the fourth and the 40th age. There lie the inexhaustible magazines. The eternal rocks, as we call them, have held their oxygen or lime undiminished, entire as it was. No particle of oxygen can rust or wear, but has the same energy as on the first morning. The good rocks, those patient waiters, say to him, "We have the sacred power as we received it. We have not failed of our trust. And now, when in our immense day the hour is at last struck, take the gas we have hoarded, mingle it with water, and let it be free to grow in plants and animals and obey the thought of man. The earth works for him. The earth is a machine which yields almost gratuitous service to every application of intellect. Every plant is a manufacture of soil. In the stomach of the plant, development begins. The tree can draw on the whole air, the whole earth, on all the rolling main. The plant is all suction pipe, imbibing from the ground by its root, from the air by its leaves, with all its might. The air works for him. The atmosphere, a sharp solvent, drinks the essence and spirit of every solid on the globe. A minstrel which melts the mountains into it. Air is matter subdued by heat. As the sea is the grand receptacle of all rivers, so the air is the receptacle from which all things spring, and into which they all return. The invisible and creeping air takes form and solid mass. Our senses are skeptics and believe only the impression of the moment, and do not believe the chemical fact that these huge mountain chains are made up of gases and rolling wind. But nature is as subtle as she is strong. She turns her capital day by day, deals never with dead, but ever with quick subjects. All things are flowing, even those that seem immovable. The adamant is always passing into smoke. The plants imbibe the materials which they want from the air and the ground. They burn, that is, exhale, and decompose their own bodies into the air and earth again. The animal burns or undergoes the like perpetual consumption. The earth burns, the mountains burn and decompose, slower but incessantly. It is almost inevitable to push the generalization up into higher parts of nature, rank over rank, into sentient beings. Nations burn with internal fire of thought and affection, which wastes while it works. We shall find finer combustion and finer fuel. Intellect is a fire. Rash and pitiless it melts this wonderful bone house, which is called man. Genius, even as it is the greatest good, is the greatest harm. Whilst all thus burns, the universe is a blaze kindled from the torch of the sun. It needs a perpetual tempering, a phlegm, a sleep, atmospheres of azote, deluges of water, to check the fury of the conflagration, a hoarding to check the spending, a centrifugence equal to the centrifugens, and this is invariably supplied. Railroad dirt cars are good excavators, but there is no porter like gravitation, who will bring down any weights which man cannot carry, and if he wants aid, knows where to find his fellow laborers. Water works in masses and sets its irresistible shoulder to your mills or your ships, or transports vast boulders of rock in its iceberg 1,000 miles. But its far greater power depends on its talent of becoming little and entering the smallest holes and pores. By this agency carrying in solution elements needful to every plant, the vegetable world exists. But, as I said, we must not paint the farmer in rose color. Whilst these grand energies have wrought for him and made his task possible, he is habitually engaged in small economies and is taught the power that lurks in petty things. Great is the force of a few simple arrangements. For instance, powers of a fence. On the prairie, you wander 100 miles and hardly find a stick or a stone. At rare intervals, a thin oak opening has been spared, and every such section has been long occupied. But the farmer manages to procure wood from far, puts up a railed fence, and at once the seeds sprout and the oak rise. It was only browsing and fire which had kept them down. Plant fruit trees by the roadside, and their fruit will never be allowed to ripen. Draw a pine fence about them, and for 50 years they mature for the owner their delicate fruit. There is a great deal of enchantment in a chestnut rail or picketed pine boards. Nature suggests every economical expedient somewhere on a great scale. Set out a pine tree, and it dies in the first year, or lives a poor spindle. But nature drops a pine cone in Mariposa, and it lives 15 centuries, grows 300 or 400 feet high and 30 in diameter, grows in a groove of giants, like a colonnade of Thebes. Ask the tree how it was done. It did not grow on a ridge, but in a basin, where it found deep soil, cold enough and dry enough for the pine, defended itself from the sun by growing in groves, and from the wind by the walls of the mountain. The roots that shot deepest and the stems of happiest exposure drew the nourishment from the rest, until the less thrifty perish and manured the soil for the stronger, and the mammoth sequoias rose to their enormous proportions. The traveler who saw them remembered his orchard at home, where every year in the destroying wind, his forlorn trees pined like suffering virtue. In September, when the pears hang heaviest and are taking from the sun their gay colors, comes usually a gusty day which shakes the whole garden and throws down the heaviest fruit in bruised heaps. Planter took the hint of these sequoias, built a high wall, or better, surrounded the orchard with a nursery of birches and evergreens. Thus, he had the mountain basin in miniature, and his pears grew to the size of melons, and the vines beneath them ran an eighth of a mile. But this shelter creates a new climate. The wall that keeps off the strong wind keeps off the cold wind. The high wall reflecting the heat back on the soil gives that acre a quadruple share of sunshine. Quote, enclosing in the garden square a dead and standing pool of air, and makes a little Cuba within it, whilst all without is Labrador. The chemist comes to his aid every year by following out some new hint drawn from nature, and now affirms that this dreary space occupied by the farmer is needless. He will concentrate his kitchen garden into a box of 1 or 2 rods square, will take the roots into his laboratory. The vines and stalks and stems may go sprawling about in the fields outside. He will attend to the roots in his tub, gorge them with food, and in food that is good for them. The smaller his garden, the better he can feed it, and the larger the crop. As he nursed his Thanksgiving turkeys on bread and milk, so he will pamper his peaches and grapes on the viands they like best. If they have an appetite for potash or salt or iron or ground bones, or even now and then for a dead hog, he will indulge them. They keep the secret well, and never tell on your table whence they draw their sunset complexion or their delicate flavors. See what the farmer accomplishes by a cartload of tiles. He alters the climate by letting off water which kept the land cold through constant evaporation, and allows the warm rain to bring down into the roots the temperature of the air and of the surface soil. And he deepens the soil, since the discharge of this standing water allows the roots of his plants to penetrate below the surface to the subsoil, and accelerates the ripening of the crop. The town of Concord is one of the oldest towns in this country, far on now in its 3rd century. These selectmen have once in every 5 years perambulated the boundaries, and yet in this very year a large quantity of land has been discovered and added to the town without a murmur of complaint from any quarter. By drainage, we went down to a subsoil we did not know, and have found there is a concord under Old Concord, which we are now getting the best crops from, and Middlesex under Middlesex, and in fine, that Massachusetts has a basement story more valuable and that promises to pay a better rent than all the superstructure. But these tiles have acquired by association a new interest. These tiles are political economists, confuters of Malthus and Ricardo. They are so many young Americans announcing a better era, more bread. They drain the land, make it sweet and friable, have made English chat moss a garden, and will now do as much for the dismal swamp. But beyond this benefit, they are the text of better opinions and better auguries for mankind. There has been a nightmare bred in England of indigestion and spleen among landlords and loom lords, namely, the dogma that men breed too fast for the powers of the soil, that men multiply in a geometrical ratio, whilst corn multiplies only in an arithmetical, and hence that the more prosperous we are, the faster we approach these frightful limits. Nay, the plight of every new generation is worse than of the foregoing, because the first comers take up the best lands, the next the second best, and each succeeding wave of population is driven to poorer so that the land is ever yielding less returns to enlarging hosts of eaters. Henry Carey of Philadelphia replied, "Not so, Mr. Malthus, but just the opposite of so is the fact. The first planter, the savage, without helpers, without tools, looking chiefly to safety from his enemy, man or beast, takes poor land. The better lands are loaded with timber, which he cannot clear. They need drainage, which he cannot attempt. He cannot plow, or fell trees, or drain the rich swamp. He is a poor creature. He scratches with a sharp stick, lives in a cave or a hutch, has no road, but the trail of the moose or bear. He lives on their flesh, when he can kill one, on roots and fruits when he cannot. He falls and is lame. He coughs. He has a stitch in his side. He has a fever and chills. When he is hungry, he cannot always kill and eat a bear. Chances of war. Sometimes the bear eats him. It is long before he digs or plants at all, and then only a patch. Later he learns that his planting is better than hunting, that the earth works faster for him than he can work for himself. Works for him when he is asleep, when it rains, when heat overcomes him. The sunstroke, which knocks him down, brings his corn up, and his family thrive, and other planters come up around him. He begins to fell trees and clear good land. And when, by and by, there is more skill, and tools and roads, the new generations are strong enough to open the lowlands where the wash of mountains has accumulated the best soil, which yield 100-fold the former crops. The last lands are the best lands. It needs science and great numbers to cultivate the best lands, and in the best manner. Thus, true political economy is not mean, but liberal, and on the pattern of the sun and sky. Population increases in the ratio of morality. Credit exists in the ratio of morality. Meantime, we cannot enumerate the incidents and agents of the farm without reverting to their influence on the farmer. He carries out this cumulative preparation of means to their last effect. This crust of soil which ages have refined, he refines again for the feeding of a civil and instructed people. The great elements with which he deals cannot leave him unaffected or unconscious of his ministry, but their influence somewhat resembles that which the same nature has on the child, of subduing and silencing him. We see the farmer with pleasure and respect when we think what powers and utilities are so meekly worn. He knows every secret of labor. He changes the face of the landscape. Put him on a new planet, and he would know where to begin. Yet there is no arrogance in his bearing, but a perfect gentleness. The farmer stands well on the world, plain in manners as in dress. He would not shine in palaces, and is absolutely unknown and inadmissible therein, living or dying. He never shall be heard of in them. Yet the drawing room heroes put down beside him would shrivel in his presence. He solid and unexpressive, they expressed to gold leaf. But he stands well on the world, as Adam did, as an Indian does, as Homer's heroes, Agamemnon or Achilles, do. He is a person whom a poet or any clime Milton, Ferdusi, or Cervantes would appreciate as being really a piece of the old nature, comparable to sun and moon, rainbow and flood, because he is, as all natural persons are, representative of nature as much as these. That uncorrupted behavior which we admire in animals and in young children belongs to him, to the hunter, the sailor, the man who lives in the presence of nature. Cities force growth and make men talkative and entertaining, but they make them artificial. What possesses interest for us is the natural of each, his constitutional excellence. This is forever a surprise, engaging, and lovely. We cannot be satisfied with knowing it and about it, and it is this which the conversation with nature cherishes and guards.